The Black Death, a pandemic that decimated Europe in the 14th century, is often remembered for its devastating impact. But what about those who survived? This is their story. Imagine a disease so devastating that it wiped out nearly half of Europe's population in just a few years. The Black Death of the 14th century was one such catastrophe, leaving a trail of despair and death in its wake. Yet, amidst this horror, some individuals survived. Was it sheer luck, or did they possess unique traits or strategies that shielded them from the deadliest plague in history? Most of us have grown up with a very simple image of the Black Death, a mysterious disease that swept through medieval Europe like a biblical curse, killing indiscriminately and leaving no chance for survival. And to be fair, it did kill a lot. Tens of millions, in fact. So it's no wonder people believe that surviving the plague was purely luck, like flipping a coin in the middle of a storm. But that belief misses something huge. You see, the plague didn't kill everyone. Entire towns didn't vanish. Some people, somehow, lived. In fact, certain families, villages, and even professions had far lower death rates than others. Yet we rarely hear about them. Because focusing on the horror makes for a better story. It's the tragedy we remember, not the resilience. The real truth? Survival wasn't just luck. There were patterns, habits, circumstances that separated the dead from the living, and once you dig deeper it becomes clear. Some people knew how to beat the plague, even if they didn't know why it worked. And in this video, we're breaking down exactly how they did it. Here's the truth no one talks about. The survivors of the Black Death weren't just lucky, they were doing things differently. Let's start with something surprising. When historians studied the 14th century plague records, they noticed something strange. Not all communities were affected equally. Some towns lost over 70% of their population. Others lost barely 10%. Why? Because certain factors dramatically increased your odds of surviving. Things like where you lived, what you ate, how you worked, and how your community responded. Take geography, for example. People in isolated villages or highland areas often survived at higher rates than those packed into urban slums. Why? Less human contact, less trade, fewer infected fleas and rats. Now look at occupation. Wealthy merchants and priests who had frequent contact with people and goods were hit hard. But farmers and shepherds? Many lived through it, simply because their jobs kept them at a distance from infection sources. Then there's behavior. Some communities instinctively practiced a form of social distancing. Others quarantined ships and travelers, early versions of what we now call public health policies. And even more interesting, some people had stronger immune responses thanks to genetics, which researchers have literally traced to surviving descendants today. So no, survival wasn't random. When you line up the data, the patterns become obvious. Survivors shared certain conditions, habits, or even genes, and those differences made all the difference. And in the next chapters, we're going to break down exactly what those survival strategies were. Once you realize that survival during the Black Death wasn't just random chance, you start seeing patterns in the chaos. And here's the part most history books gloss over. The people who made it through weren't just lucky. They were resourceful, strategic, and in some cases, straight up radical. Take the plague doctors. Everyone knows the creepy bird masks, right? What most people don't realize is that the herbs stuffed inside those beaks were more than medieval superstition. They acted as rudimentary air filters. While they couldn't cure the plague, they helped reduce exposure to the bacteria-filled air, That's 14th century DIY PPE. Then there were entire villages that intentionally cut themselves off from the world. One English town, Ayam, became famous for quarantining itself when plague broke out. No one entered, no one left. Over half the population died, but they stopped the spread to nearby areas. That's an early form of social distancing, centuries before it became standard. But here's what's even more shocking. Some people might have had immunity. Newer research shows that some survivors carried a rare genetic mutation that strengthened their immune response. Over time, this genetic resistance was passed down, which may explain why future generations were less impacted by similar outbreaks. So, why don't we hear more about this? Why is the dominant story still they got lucky? Because it's easier. It's easier to write off a horrific event as a roll of the dice than to unpack the messy reality that some people had access to better information, cleaner environments, and even biological advantages. And the truth? That not everyone was equally vulnerable, that some survived because they knew how to fight back, challenges our entire understanding of one of the deadliest events in human history. But it gets even deeper, because the Black Death didn't just reshape who lived, it changed what they believed, and that's what we're digging into next. You've probably heard that medieval people didn't understand disease. Some even believe they thought the plague was caused by bad smells or divine punishment. And while that's partly true, here's the twist. Some cities took drastic, smart steps that eerily resemble our modern pandemic protocols. The survivors weren't always just lucky, they were strategic. In Venice, the government created what might be the first official quarantine station in Europe, a lazaretto. Ships arriving at port had to wait 40 days before anyone could disembark. And that word, quarantine, it literally comes from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days. Meanwhile, cities like Milan didn't wait for the infected to seek help, they sealed them inside their homes. Yes, it was brutal, but in some cases it worked. And then, there were social divisions. The rich fled the cities, escaping to country villas, the poor, left behind. And while that seems cruel, it inadvertently helped slow the spread. Fewer people in cities meant less transmission. It's uncomfortable to admit, but social inequality may have, in a twisted way, helped some groups survive. So no, it wasn't all superstition and chaos. There were patterns, there were methods, and for some, those choices meant life over death. You know the meme-worthy image of the long-beaked plague doctor? Yeah, those guys get clowned today. But there's more to their story than just creepy costumes. That bird-like mask? It was filled with aromatic herbs, like rosemary, cloves, and lavender, based on the belief that good smells could fight bad air or miasma. Laughable today, sure. But here's the wild part. Some of those herbs actually had mild antibacterial or insect-repelling properties. Not enough to stop Yersinia pestis, the plague bacterium, but it may have reduced exposure to fleas, the real culprits. And those beaked doctors weren't totally useless. They documented cases, kept track of symptoms, and sometimes performed crude surgeries or lanced buboes. Painful, yes, but sometimes life-saving. On the folk level, people were turning to herbal concoctions, vinegar-based washes, even fumigating rooms with smoke from rosemary or juniper. These weren't cures, but they showed that the survivors were experimenting. They weren't passive victims, they were trying everything, creating early versions of biohacks that may have slightly improved odds in a terrifyingly uncertain world. The takeaway? Even in the darkest times, humans reach for knowledge even if they don't fully understand what they're fighting. Now here's where things get really wild. Researchers studying the DNA of plague survivors' descendants have discovered something shocking. The Black Death may have actually rewired human genetics. One study from 2022 found that people with a particular version of the ERAP2 gene had a much higher chance of surviving the plague. This gene helps your body detect and kill bacteria inside cells. During the Black Death, those who had the protective version were more likely to survive, and their genes got passed on. Fast forward to today, and that genetic legacy still exists in the European population. But here's the twist: that same gene variant may now increase susceptibility to autoimmune diseases like Crohn's. It's evolution's trade-off. What helped us survive the plague might now be hurting us in different ways. So when we ask, how did some people survive the worst pandemic in history? Part of the answer might literally be in their blood. The ones who lived weren't just lucky. They may have been genetically equipped to face the deadliest disease Europe had ever seen, its survival of the fittest, written in DNA. So the next time you hear someone say that Black Death survivors just got lucky, you'll know the truth. Luck had little to do with it. They quarantined their cities, they burned infected clothes, they trusted folk remedies, even when science hadn't caught up. Some of them even carried gene variants that gave them a microscopic edge over death itself. These were not passive peasants waiting for a miracle. They were people doing everything they could to survive, even when their world was collapsing. This isn't just a story about the past, it's a mirror. Every modern pandemic, every public health crisis, every genetic breakthrough, we've been here before, in a way. The Black Death didn't just kill half of Europe. It forced the other half to innovate, adapt, and evolve. And maybe that's the biggest twist of all. Let me know in the comments, do you think we've learned from the past, or are we still repeating it? And if you like this breakdown, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the untold side of history. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes survival is less about miracles, and more about the moves you make when everything's falling apart.